Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It's Saturday, July the 11th. It's been quite a week, certainly in Ankara, Turkey. Donald Trump went to NATO meeting, met Erdogan, the Turkish strongman, promised him all sorts of things, including new F-35 fighter jets and lift the sanctions on Turkey that Trump himself imposed. Classic Trump, I guess, in a way. And we're lucky enough today to have a man in Ankara, but our man, at least for this show, in Istanbul, the great city in Turkey, straddling Asia and Europe. Kaya Genç is a very well-known Turkish novelist, commentator. He's also a contributor to an excellent anthology of essays about how America is viewed overseas. We interviewed Madeline Schwartz, the editor of it, called How We See It, The World Looks at America in the Age of Trump. And Kaya is joining us, as I said, from Istanbul. Kaya, what's the view from Istanbul, at least, on these meetings between Donald Trump and your strongman leader, Erdogan? Did they appear similar? Did one look stronger than the other, weaker than the other?
Hello, Andrew. Very good to be here. And very good to speak to you today from Istanbul. Well, before the NATO summit, there were some arrests made in Ankara, and lots of activists were rounded up one night because they were seen as a threat to NATO security for some reason. And those activists were LGBTQ right defenders and labor unionists, journalists. So when it comes to NATO, there's a sense in the Turkish civil society that it is a club of the right wing. You know, you read 1960s Turkish writers like Sevgi Soysal, for example, and you see there's big antipathy toward NATO. So if you think that NATO represents the global world order institutions in Turkey, you're wrong. In Turkey, it represents the mighty. And so it wasn't a surprise that our president, Erdogan, and your president, Trump, got along so well. And this was such a kind of military fashion show. We saw lots of jets flying in the air and revolvers being gifted among the attendees, and lots of talk about the war industry, guns and fighter jets and F-35s and S-400s, defense systems and all that. So to be fair, Ankara has been very successful in building in its defense industries. It built a model where it can support independent arms manufacturers in the country who produce drones that were used in the Ukraine-Russia war very successfully by Ukrainians. And so these exports, these military exports, have been very good for Turkish economy, but it increasingly feels that we have a kind of war economy here, very increasingly built on arms exports. So there's a sense that, and the Turkish ruling politicians don't hide it. You know, Turkey is here to produce arms, That's the mission of Turkey at the moment. It's
And you
based
got
on.
enough wars around you to supply all sorts of people. Erdogan also apparently gave all the NATO leaders pistols. I wonder if when they left the summit, I wonder if he gave Donald Trump a pistol. I don't know if he quite know what to do with it.
Well, some leaders couldn't return to their home countries with the pistols, like Keir Starmer, because Starmer said,
Classic Starmer, right? It's pathetic.
yeah, yes, and he was like, they won't allow me inside with this gun, so I have to leave it. But it's kind of a powerful message. It's very also like kind of Ottoman Sultan style messaging, like, we represent might and we
Yeah.
know how to deal with you.
We'll do a show maybe in the future, Kaya, on Erdogan himself. But I'm curious as how our man in Ankara, Donald Trump, was seen. What looking up close, what did the Turkish people see in this old American character, an 80-year-old man coming to coming to Turkey and living it up with your old man? Did he look like an old man? Was he youthful? Was he fun? Was he charismatic?
Yes, I think Trump is a star among right-wing voters everywhere. I went to India a few years ago and with my hair very, rough and stuff, and I was a bit chubbier, I guess. And someone said, "Oh, you look like Steve Bannon," and I love you for that. We are big fans of Steve Bannon,
Oh my
and
God. I hope you smacked them in
and
the mouth. Did you shoot them with your pistol?
no, I just shaved my hair and lost some pounds, but I can see that among the most educated and also those who are upward mobile, there's great love for Trump and people around him, and also in Turkey, I think the dislike for Biden was much more. I remember the Turkish media was really going after Joe Biden. But even though Trump has supported Israel to such a degree over the past half decade, still the Turkish media is very forgiving. Netanyahu is the bad man in Turkish press, but with Trump, he's kind of an ally, because he speaks our language, he really likes the Turkish presidential system.
When you say he speaks your language, you mean the language of authoritarianism rather than Turkish.
Hmm. Yeah, he's also said some Turkish words. He said "Merhaba asker,"
What does that
uh,
mean?
which is like "Hello soldier," and he was like greeting the soldiers. But he's a businessman, and he, I think, really shares the kind of Turkish right-wing values. Like he's not like super, like he's not like maybe uh, like purely religious. But he represents the religious people, but he's a capitalist at heart, and that mixture people like here, And but I think the most important thing is he deals with Turkey, and Turkey has this fascination with the U.S. The Turkish politicians can be very anti-West, Western values, but that doesn't mean they don't like US or the West. They just don't like some parts of the US. They don't like the trans movement. They don't like freedom of expression. They don't like labor rights, but they like the death penalty, maybe. They like gun ownership. Some parts of the West, very sympathetic for the Turkish right. And the one of the founders of Turkish Islamism, um, Mehmet Akif Ersoy, who also wrote the Turkish anthem. He wrote this famous poem where he looks at Germany and he says, we have to level up with Germany. We have to learn how to be as industrious as the Germans, and they really take their religion seriously. We have to do the same. We just should leave the decadent stuff out. That's the Turkish right movement. And so Trump was there. There were no real big protests against Trump. If he went to London, I'm sure he would be met with great resistance. But here, there was some attempts to protest the NATO summit. But I mean, in Ankara, it's very difficult to protest. Also in Istanbul, if you go out with a banner, they'll come after you. So um, I think I think that he really got off easily here.
As I said, you contributed an excellent essay to this wonderful anthology, How We See It. The world looks at Trump in the age of, the world looks at America in the age of Trumps, put together by the Dial editor, Madeline Schwartz, who was on the show a couple of weeks ago. What's your relationship, Kaya, with the United States? Have you spent much time here? Did you grow up looking at it nostalgically, sympathetically, in a hostile way?
Yes, I studied English literature and I'm a English literature scholar. But the first time I went to the US was in 2016, and I just weeks into Trump's first term, and I went to New York on a book tour. I went to
Yeah, and your
uh,
book at the time was Under the Shadow: Rage and Revolution in Modern Turkey, which was a big hit.
yes, so it was it came out just after the coup attempt in Turkey, and then Trump was elected, and I arrived in New York, I think in January 2017. And there were protests against Trump's Muslim ban. And so that was my first time on US soil, and I was really heartened by those protesters who were like um, anti-Trump and um, defending their city, their values, their culture. And in New York, I was visiting the Nation magazine, and some radio stations and some event venues, and everyone seemed ready to fight. And I think people saw Trump 1.0 as a kind of temporary thing. He'll be here for a few years and we'll just kick him out. We'll fight him off. And then American democracy will revert to its normal values. And so I think there was a sense that Trump's sense of um, executive presidency was seen as an exceptional thing. And as I try to explain in this essay, in Turkey, it was seen as how American politics operates and something that we have to um, imitate, and something we admire because um, for since its establishment as a republic in the 1920s, Turkey has taken Europe as a model. Parliamentary democracy. We get rid of the sultanate. We don't like one-man rule, and so now we have a parliament. And Turkey is so ethnically diverse and so many different interest groups. So let's find the voice for each of these groups in the parliament. So Turkey had a very vibrant democracy in the 1920s. But soon politicians decided that this is not a very effective way of governance. Maybe some were even missing the old sultan. And then, um, but Turkey also reforged itself as a Western, modernized country. So they decided to shift their focus from Europe to the US because they looked at the US and they saw um, a much more um, efficient country, and they decided to build the second half of the 20th century in Turkey to a kind of Americanization project. And it started with the Marshall Plan in the 1940s and the aftermath of the Second World War, and Turkey really benefited from it. And so you see lots of American investments in Turkey, highways and Hilton hotels and burger joints. And so suddenly the very rapidly Europeanized Turkey was very rapidly Americanized. And so when you look at the old people in Turkey, they know about the history of this. So when they look at an American politician, they feel happy that they come to Turkey and shake our president's hand and say so many good things about him. And you know, since the past decades, we also have a presidential system, and people like me were very much against it. We very much wanted to defend our old presidential, our old parliamentary democracy, but we had a referendum and people voted for it, and now we are living the consequences of Americanization in Turkey.
You speak of this Americanization, but of course there are many Americas, Kai. You don't need me to tell you that. Even after the war in the Marshall Plan age, there was the FDR, New Deal America, and increasingly more of a free market, libertarian America. Of those Americas, was FDR's New Deal, was this version of America, was this the one that was embraced by Turkish politicians and society, or did people not distinguish between a New Deal America and a free market America?
Well, the FDR America is, of course, very different from the NATO years and the anti-communist America. And so, from 1950s onward, um, America's role changed in Turkey. And as you say, there are different Americas, of course. I mean, I grew up with HBO and I grew up in New York. Even though I visited New York for the first time in 2017. And I've never been an anti-American when I was growing up. And I really didn't like anti-American people in Turkey. I always believed that um, the the labor movement in America, the artists in America, the poets in America. There was a different America that maybe wasn't represented in the politics, maybe a little bit represented by Democrats. And so um, for people like us, America was also an escape, and it remains a way of escaping the reality around us, because geography and the spaces and the kind of the music, the jazz music, and there are so many things that really rescues one's mind when you're living here and when you're really, um, really frustrated by the politics, by the culture around you. America comes to your rescue, and I'm very much aware of that. But Turkey's ties with America, that has always been very militaristic, and the anti-communism in Turkey that has taken root after the 1950s, and that led to the really proliferation of the Turkish right-wing movements, that has always been seen, I think rightly so, by the Turkish left as an extension of Americanization, and the role that NATO has given Turkey as a kind of defense mechanism against the communists Eastern Europe. And so, I look at the kind of most hard right elements in Turkish history and society that's still around us. And they have a very long history with NATO and NATO values, this anti-communism, this NATO brand of anti-communism. But at the same time, I returned to the US, as I write in my piece, during Biden years. And of course, that's the wonderful America um, that I kind of grew up with in the 1990s, the kind of HBO America, the kind of California America, and suddenly America was again freedom. And also around the same time in 2019, there were big opposition victories in Turkey, Um, Istanbul had a new mayor called Ekrem İmamoğlu,
Yeah, and you
and
have an excellent piece, new piece in the Dial, where you call him the hologram, or the editor there, probably our friend Madeline Schwartz calls him the hologram candidate.
yeah, and so when he was elected, he wasn't a hologram candidate. He was very present. He was everywhere, like physically. You could see him in the city, in weddings, in funerals, and
He was a
you
bit of a
know,
mandami, was he?
yes, absolutely. And you have to be like that to be a Istanbul mayor. And he was very young, and he implemented this kind of socialist municipalism ideology, which is like using the municipality as a kind of progressive force to fight against injustice. And so he was very popular, and all the big Turkish cities were voting for the opposition. So during the Biden years, there was great hope in Turkey that, you know, we just like, we now have the good America back in power, and now maybe we'll have the opposition in power as well. And then, of course, that was very alarming for Ankara. Also, these ties with, I mean, these hopes that these politicians created. And so when Trump was reelected, um, and when those opposition mayors in Turkey started to experience these difficulties, it was very good timing for the Turkish right and the American right. And I think they just walked together this path of, crushing the opposition.
Kaya, one of your compatriots, I know you know her, Eche Timilkur, and she's an old friend of mine and of the show. She was recently on the show talking about her new book, Nation of Strangers. But she's very well known for a book that came out a few years ago, How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Fascism, which takes the Turkish case and globalizes it and suggests that what happened in Turkey will happen elsewhere. And when the book came out, a lot of people thought, well, this isn't going to happen in our country, in the UK, in the in the United Kingdom or the US. But of course, in the US, in some ways, it seems to have. Is the Turkish model? Did Erdogan, did he create a model? I mean, maybe not knowingly, for people like Trump, or is Trump teaching Erdogan new autocratic tricks of how to infiltrate the state and use it to promote your own power and wealth?
Yes, as I tried to explain in my essay in our book, it is a kind of dialogue between two powers. I don't think Turkey invented a model, and I don't think Trump created something. I think there is a kind of, among the leftists, there was always the international brigades and a kind of internationalist spirit, like the left in Spain learns from the left in Germany, and there's kind of this has always been seen as part of leftist thinking, and maybe yes, the neoliberals, met at this place and invented neoliberalism. There are always, stories about how neoliberalism has been created, but I think today um, we see populism, right-wing populism, learning from each other. It's like AI learning from large language models, and it makes sense. Like if you are a right-wing populist, why wouldn't you learn from a successful right-wing populist?
Yeah, and that's of
Uh,
course the fascination of your lookalike Steve Bannon with not just Turkey but also Orban in Hungary. So Bannon certainly has that internationalist quality. Maybe it's no surprise that his strategy seems to be somewhat Leninist in terms of its seizure of power.
yes, and also we also had the same thing, I think, here with the AKP, a kind of Gramscian war, culture war. Like you want institutions You first go into these institutions, and slowly you erode a culture, and you replace it with your own. And I mean, I go to Italy a lot, and in Italy you see um, Meloni and the kind of how can we present a kind of fascist rooted politician in a democratic outlook. You know, we are now seeing it in France with Marine Le Pen returning to the presidential race. And, you know, these really cosmetic soft brushes that make these politicians seem much more acceptable. And also in Britain with Nigel Farage and people around him. And so when I see that, I don't feel like, oh, they are building on the Turkish model per se, but I feel that they're joining the club of right-wing politicians who are accepted whatever they do domestically. You know, it's like if you project power to the world, if you are interested in geopolitics, if you present strength in places like the NATO summit, um, then whatever you do domestically maybe doesn't matter that much anymore. And our friends in the European Union, they've been very silent about the things going on here.
Yeah, they're too
Uh,
worried. Starmer's too worried about taking his pistol home. It's interesting, Kaya, you bring up Gramsci. You say you go to Italy quite a lot. Of course, the quote from Gramsci that's been making the rounds recently is the one about the interregnum and the idea that we're stuck in an interregnum in history. We know that the old is dead, but we're not quite sure what's coming. But I wonder whether the world that you are becoming increasingly familiar with in Turkey, and we perhaps in the United States, this soft Hollywood style autocracy, that is the future, that we're not in an interregnum, that this is the new world.
yes, it feels like that, and it feels like the kind of liberal, the soft liberalism that I myself have believed in from the 90s and the early 2000s. It's becoming really, um, it's just disappearing. In Turkey, we saw it um, take shape in different political parties, you know, soft-spoken centrists. They don't have a following anymore. And in Turkey, we see that people like Imamoglu or other opposition mayors, they really implemented these socialist policies. So what we see is if, you know, there's a resurgence of far right that's maybe that carries um, echoes of the 20th century, early 20th century, perhaps uh, the opposite will happen too. And it did happen in Turkey, and it was very successful. And people who were skeptical, who said, "Oh, don't follow socialist policies. You know, it will alienate the pious. It will alienate this group, that group." It really didn't alienate those groups. And so I think maybe without using the word socialist, but just using those policies, they're very popular. And I read that they even use the word socialists
In
in
the
the
United
US.
States, yeah,
Yes,
Mandami and
and
AOC.
yeah, and not
Uh,
only in New York, but also in Middle America. And um, I guess young people are really doing their reading, or maybe they're encountering this on TikTok or I don't know where, but there was great pushback against the fascists and the far rights in the 20th century, and now they think it's time for the pushback. And where do they find their heroes? Maybe not in Hillary Clinton or some, I don't know, some more centrist politician, but maybe some dead poets from the 20th century, maybe people like Rosa Luxemburg. You know, suddenly those writers are becoming popular. And I recently reviewed a book which is coming out in English. It's called Walking. It's coming from New York Review Books. It's a beautiful book by Sevgi Soysal, a communist Turkish novelist who died aged 40 from breast cancer. And she writes about Ankara, the city of the NATO summit and Trump and all these leaders. And she writes about how this city is slowly killing itself because of the profit motive, because of Turkey's transformation. And she's trying to stay alive in this kind of slow death of the city. And it really resonated with me because I was just reading it before the NATO summit. So it's a long process, this.
Yeah, maybe in the future, Madeline Schwartz will come out with the second volume, How We See It, The World Looks at America in the Age of Mandami, or Bernie Sanders, or AOC. We had Tad Devine on the show earlier this week. He was Bernie Sanders' campaign manager, and he talks about how the Democrats literally, and this is the title of his book, screwed Bernie. So perhaps the time is right now for the Democrats to embrace maybe not Bernie Sanders, but AOC or Mandami or another kind of leftist politician. So,
Yeah.
are you still,
Yeah.
Kai, are you still then cautiously optimistic about America perhaps being the inspiration for moderates, for progressives, for those people who believe in democracy and free speech? Or might it come from somewhere else, maybe even from Ankara or Turkey?
Yeah, I mean, we need these big parties. Like in Turkey, we have the Republican People's Party, Atatürk's party. In the US, you have the Democratic Party. And, the right wing always wants fragmentation. Why don't the socialists leave those parties and form something new so that we can, fight with the centrists? But we need the socialists to really conquer these parties and to make them closer to power. We need those ideas in power. And in the US, I'm still optimistic. Also in Turkey, I think, the Atatürk's party is having lots of legal troubles at the moment. We can talk about it maybe another day. The leader has changed after a court order, and
the
so many.
Ataturk party, of course, is the party of what
Republican People's Party.
an
Yeah.
aggressive secularism in contrast with Erdogan.
Yes, and it's a party in transformation. It has implemented Turkey's Europeanization in the 20s and 30s. It was anti-communist in the 40s, and then it was very leftist in the 60s. So a very long history. But it's a big party. It's a machine to win elections. You need this machine. It's always easy to vote for the Trotskyist Communist Party, and then you have your 0% vote, and then everyone is happy. But when you have these progressive ideas in big parties, then that's how you make the change. So I'm optimistic for Italy and for the US, for Turkey. But I think that the ideas that seem marginal and radical, they have to stay, they have to retain their form, but they have to be represented in these big political parties so that they can come to power, because when they are implemented from above, they're very popular, and they have to be implemented. They shouldn't stay just in the books.
One question, Kaya, one character we haven't brought up, we've talked a lot about Trump and Erdogan, is Putin. And of course, you're talking to me from Istanbul, so much closer to Russia and the war in Ukraine. Is Putin and Putinism, was it a model? Does it remain a model for Erdogan and maybe even Trump? Lots of conspiracy theories, of course, particularly back in 2016 about Trump and Putin. Most of them, I think, have been disproved. Most of them are, to put it mildly, exaggerated. But is Putin, in a sense, an extreme model for the world of Trump and Erdogan? Or is he different?
Maybe he was a decade ago, but not anymore. He I mean, Turkey has a historical antipathy toward Russia. You know, we have the Crimean War, and Turkey has historically been against Russia. You know, the kind of the all the not just the NATO anti-communism, but also during the 19th century. And so there is not much love for the Russian system, and there are so many Turkic people in former Soviet states, and Turkish right has always fought for their independence. And so the kind of Russian Tsar, we say Char, but you say Tsar.
Mm.
And so we don't have any sympathy for that. Uh, and you know, you look at the Turkish trade. Turkey does most of its trade with Europe, Germany, Ukraine, US. You know, actually, Russia is turning into a footnote. And I think this latest NATO summit, we today learned that the Turkish government is returning the S-400 defense systems to a third country, so that it's getting rid of those uh, defense defense systems, so that it can get the F-35s from the US. So Turkey has really turned its back toward the US and against Russia, particularly in the past few months. So, and also in Istanbul, you see lots of Ukrainians, Ukrainian refugees, lots of people working in tech, lots of young people, and there is not much love for Putin or his autocracy here. I don't see it in the Turkish newspapers. And he's never presented as a kind of model in the same way that Trump and um, his way of ruling White House is a model for Turkey.
You mentioned Netanyahu. In the United States, of course, Gaza is increasingly becoming a divisive issue. What's the view, less of Gaza, but what's the view from Istanbul, Turkey, on American involvement, the American relationship with Israel?
Well, it's accepted as a fact. People are realists here, and I don't think anyone expects something different from the US. You know, Kamala Harris was proposing something slightly different, but even that didn't get good press here. You know, for the Dial, we were looking at how the presidential race in the US um, was covered in countries like Turkey, and I was surprised that how little criticism for Trump was in the Turkish media, and actually people didn't like the Democrats. They were afraid that they could come back into power, and so with Israel, um, you know, the longer Netanyahu stays in power, um, the longer the the we feel right that, you know, there's a extremist in power in Israel, and there are no kind of moderates in Israel, and so let's be anti-Israel. You know, it's easier to do that. And you know, I wrote a piece some years back for Jewish Quarterly about anti-Semitism in Turkey, and it is, you know, it's poison. It's a very poisonous ideology, and it's a very powerful um, part of the Turkish right. And so it's alarming that, you know, the more outrageous things Netanyahu says, the more anti-Semitic groups are empowered. So um, I mean, if you're concerned about anti-Semitism in Turkey, you're concerned about Netanyahu because he really empowers these groups. And yes, so he's actually kind of uh, the bad person, the first number one here in Turkey, and that won't change. And you know, that makes anti-Semitic people happy, and so it's um, hopefully things will change in Israel and there'll be some moderation also
Convenient
about.
for everyone. Then, very briefly,
Yes.
Kai, you're not a geostrategic expert, I know, but your focus is more on film literature. Um, what about Iran? How is American involvement in Iran, which seems at best blustering, slightly absurd? How is it viewed? It's your neighborhood, so you have a closer
Yes.
view of it than we do in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, the Iran's involvement in the Syrian civil war and its support for the regime, so Turkey doesn't really have that kind of sympathy. Also, like just like for Russia and Putin, for also for historical reasons, also for religious reasons. Not much love for Iran, but
Do you mean for
um,
the Sunni, because Iran is Shia and Sunni, and Turkey is Sunni?
yes, I mean, history plays a big role in present day politics here, and the Ottoman history and the all those historical wars and everything. But of course, the thing that Turks hate the most is foreign interventions. And so when the US was waging its war, everything else lost importance. And so, um, I mean, if you look at pro-government media, of course, it's anti-US and it's pro-Iran. Yes, we can say that it's pro-Iran. But it's also about Venezuela when America does its operations in Venezuela. The pro-government media um, is vehemently against it, and there's always the fear, and also the kind of the maybe the fear that America will come for us. There's always a fear, but then something is stopping that. What is stopping it? Erdogan's relationship with Trump. They're good friends, and so America will never attack Turkey. So it's kind of, it sounds like a fairy tale, but I mean that's what politics is seen in Turkey these days. And also we have also some Iranian refugees, and we have lots of Iranian communities in Turkey, even from before the war. And we did some reporting on that for Index on Censorship, the British magazine. Lots of Iranian dissidents. So we have lots of Iranian dissidents, Russian dissidents based in Istanbul because Istanbul is a good hub for these dissidents. And, um, Turkey is not kicking those people out. Turkey is actually protecting these people. And so I think Turkey is enjoying this um, kind of
Yeah, maybe
control.
Turkey or Istanbul is the new Paris or the New York. Finally, you've written some powerful pieces on Turkish filmmakers standing up to Erdogan's autocracy. You wrote an interesting piece in The Guardian, another about another filmmaker, one called Ceylan, for this was an essay in foreign policy. We had Kaya, one of America's great film critics on the show, David Thompson, on a couple of weeks ago, who's written a book suggesting that Trumpism is the outcome of American love affair with Hollywood and the screen and the violence of movies like The Godfather. What's your take? I mean, you've said that you've been a lover of America since the 90s, HBO. I assume you also love American movies. Do you
Yes.
think that Hollywood and its glamorization of violence, movies like The Godfather, do you think that in a way has contributed to the emergence of these strong men, particularly Trump, but maybe even Erdogan and the other strongmen leaders in Europe, that movie directors have glamorized violence and strong men over the years?
Yes, that was a great interview, and I love David Thompson. and he's one of my heroes. And I think his diagnosis is on the mark, especially about The Godfather. And there's this kind of cult of the powerful helping each other, helping the family, and moral relativism, and the male models represented in that film. And I still remember like the closing of the door and leaving the woman outside, all those very um, animalistic scenes, and it feels just like, yes, that's how life works. The film Hollywood gives you that sense, and I see lots of Turkish right-wing columnists using um, Carleone as kind of their Twitter banners, like that scene, and like he's really the hero, like he's the boss, and even you know the aspiration to become that kind of boss who delivers, and also with the Sopranos, we were talking about HBO, that kind
Mm-hmm.
of, yes, he's a pig sometimes, but he delivers the food, and that's like, this is reality, this is the truth, and cinema gives us the truth, and that kind of illusion that David Thompson talks about, I think it's very on the mark. And as you say, I wrote about Nuri Bilge Ceylan, and he writes about the cynical Turks, the cynicism that people live in this country to survive. And some people are critical of his cinema because they think that it's kind of legitimizing this cynicism. Because also these powerful 3 hour long films you watch and you say, yes, this is how life works. You only survive by cynicism. If you're an idealist, this is what happens. And this is actually how people behave. And like cinema is the only way to show that. And so, um, but then what's the alternative? Do we have to hate cinema now? Do we have to say, yes, cinema is legitimizing this, and so we shouldn't watch it? But I think, I think when you look at um, kind of more experimental cinema that is problematizing the objectivity of cinema, objectivity of camera, objectivity of narration, then we have something maybe more critical, but still, what filmmakers, what films, it's very difficult to dislike them. But I think David Thompson is also right, and I'm so glad that he came back to say his piece in interviews like yours, and everyone is talking about The Godfather and American politics now. It's incredible.
Well, Kaya Genç, wonderful conversation. Your contribution, again, an excellent contribution to a wonderful anthology of essays about how the world is looking at America in the age of Trump, how we see it. Kaya, lovely to talk to you. Keep well in
Thank you.
Istanbul, and we will catch up again. It's always nice to have friends overseas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Always good to be here.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.